Okay, hey everybody, we will continue here with our World War II stuff, leaving off after part one with the occupation zones of Berlin. And that was such a tricky situation after World War II because Berlin was divided into four zones. Like we talked about in class, when the Berlin Wall was built, it was built around the western zones that were operated by the free part of Berlin. You see this pretty definitive line here. What starts to happen after World War II is that Joseph Stalin did not give up control of Eastern Europe. Oops, well, I'm sure they can read Europe there. And the western part in blue, I know this map is in another language, but it still has the most definitive lines, so I like it. They remained democratic and capitalist as far as private business, ownership, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, basic civil liberties, and Stalin does not allow that in the communist portions there on the red. So with that line, Winston Churchill makes a really famous speech in 1946, comes to the United States. There you see President Truman also present at this random little college in the state of Missouri. And Churchill refers to an iron curtain in the speech separating Europe. It is not a real wall, so it's easy for a lot of people to get the Berlin Wall confused with the Iron Curtain, but it's Churchill's metaphorical to the sharp divisions and democratic, capitalist Western Europe. There were such distinctions between the two sides. So this iron curtain that is separating the free parts of Europe from the Soviet-controlled communist portions of the European continent. So Churchill is making that reference. And as your discussions were on the Marshall Plan, this is something that accelerates the differences between Western Europe and Eastern Europe along that distinct division that occurs there, because what the Marshall Plan did was the U.S. gave billions in to the countries of Western Europe, so great financial deals to the countries of Western Europe to help them rebuild. We talked earlier in the part one video about the infrastructure damages that those countries were facing. Money was offered to Joseph Stalin. He did not accept that. And so what this did is, since those countries in Western Europe were able to rebuild more quickly, this accelerated the differences, between the two sides on either side of the Iron Curtain. So Western Europe and Eastern Europe becoming very different in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and those differences between the Western countries and Joseph Stalin only continuing to go deeper. Truman then adds to this acceleration because the United States is so freaked out by communism. The Truman Doctrine says that the U.S. will provide aid primarily financially trying to those countries where threat of communism was real. So the United States becoming more proactive instead of reactive in international politics, and then this idea of containment, preventing communism from spreading. Instead of going after the direct source in the Soviet Union, it's bugging me that this isn't centered, instead of going after the direct source and risking nuclear warfare, the United States is going to become very, for a couple of decades, very committed to this idea of containing communism by preventing it from spreading. If one of you suddenly started throwing up and turning completely purple, we might evacuate the building and make sure you got food and supplies that you would need to survive, but we're not going to go straight in and kill you. We're just going to quarantine you and prevent it from spreading to someone else. And so we get, as far as our definition of the Cold War, let's see if I can find the world during a map of the world during the Soviet Union's time in power, and how much territory they controlled. So much land has been, what looks like a good map. Well, we'll just have to go with this one, but so much of the world is going to be under, oh, scary thing. Let's look at a map of the world. If we look at a political map of the world, the Soviet Union being so massive, but Russia now remaining as that big. What happened to just being able to open a simple image in Google? I feel old when I say I remember the days when you could just open an image simply. But with the Soviet Union controlling so much territory, we are going to end up in other global conflicts as we try to prevent communism from spreading. The Korean War has not officially ended. There's an armistice between them from 1950 to 1953. The United States involved in this. The Vietnam War. We don't want communism to spread under Ho Chi Minh, a guy who will end up victorious there. And so we're fighting this situation in Vietnam. Part of the situation where Iran hates us is because we were worried about communist influence in Iran, and the United States helps install a guy known as the Shah in Iran in the 50s, and then he's going to be despised and mistreats a lot of people. And then in the Islamic Revolution in the 70s, the Ayatollah Khomeini will overthrow him, and then they start to hate the United States. So the Cuban Missile Crisis that we've already discussed as we jumped ahead in class, we've sort of failed in this idea of containing communism from spreading. Situations in Afghanistan later. So we're involved in all of these other conflicts to try to prevent communism from spreading. So that becomes a major, major part of our foreign policy. Since Stalin held control of East Germany, as the world is risking nuclear warfare, there is a dramatic situation where he tries to push the envelope during the Berlin blockade. So Berlin, what was happening is as the British and French and Americans were providing supplies to the people in Western Berlin, providing food, because if you're living in a big city, you obviously don't have access to farms right there, and it's up to those other countries to, and basically this is the borders of Germany as a whole, which is being overseen, as we talked about, in those occupation zones. All of a sudden, one day in 1948, the roads and train lines are blocked off to Berlin. Stalin blocked access, that's a weird K, to the Western-held portions of Berlin. How are those people going to survive? how do you respond? Do you go to war against the Soviet Union? Do you give up control of that portion of Berlin? And so there's this huge question of what to do. Everyone concerned now at this time where the Soviet Union is developing nuclear technology of whether you're already going to risk World War III to provide for those people living in the free portions of Berlin. And so there's this dramatic tension, and the way that the Americans and others respond is through the Berlin Airlift. The supplies were dropped off by air, so instead of going by road or by train or attacking the Soviet Union, for a couple of years, low-flying airplanes will provide what these citizens of the western-held portions of Berlin need. I've got a friend from church who grew up in the American-held portion of, or American overseen portion of Berlin, and she remembers there's a cute story about how, as a little kid, she says it was very easy to cheat on tests during the Berlin airlift because these planes were flying so low, dropping off supplies, that you could ask the person out of the side next to you, out of the side of your mouth, what's the answer to number 5? And your teacher didn't hear you because it was so loud. So, and she has friends who came a couple of years ago to try to thank the surviving American pilots who dropped off those supplies, because it really did save their lives. And eventually Joseph Stalin relented and reopened access. So we've avoided nuclear war. There's so many close calls. Because of this fear that the Soviet Union might come after you, NATO is formed. This is something that we still have today. Its existence is sort of debated. It has more countries. But this North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so something we are still in today, developed during the Cold War as a mutual defense alliance. If one of these countries in yellow was attacked by the Soviet Union, then it's essentially an attack on everybody. All of those other countries would respond. You're trying to be proactive, sort of deter the Soviet Union, so they can say, if we attack one person, everybody else is going to get involved. So we're still in this. It's part of why after September 11th, other countries like Italy and England and Belgium sent troops to Afghanistan to try. We had been attacked. So NATO, this military defense, mutual military, it should be obvious enough, I guess, defensive alliance. So if one country is attacked, essentially it's like all of the other countries that attack. Soviet Union tried a couple of similar measures, similar names. Probably the most famous one is the Warsaw Pact. Communist country military defense alliance. So this was strategic. This just shows how massive the Soviet Union is. But Warsaw is the capital of Poland, even though the Soviet Union essentially controls it. They're saying, oh, well, we'll make it sound like everybody else wants to be a part of it as well, so we'll call it the Warsaw Pact. So these two sides, we've got these two military alliances that are massive, as the world still remains on the border of nuclear warfare. After World War II, Stalin does die in 1953, after almost 30 years in charge as the Soviet premier. He is buried at just outside of the Kremlin. You can see his grace, not a word associated with Stalin. A little statue bust of him still sort of glaring at anybody who comes by, just to remember the man of steel, as he had named himself. So Stalin dies, and the man who replaces him is Khrushchev. Remember, hard name spell, but it can get those 3 H's in there. Nikita Khrushchev, the man with a girl first name. Khrushchev is a little, he makes it clear he does not endorse some of the violence that Stalin used, but he will be in charge for a while, and as we've already talked about, since we've gotten ahead, we see some major developments still in the Cold War where he's not about to let go of Soviet-held territory, and we get in some scary moments in the Cuban Missile Crisis and Berlin Wall constructed under his regime in charge of the Soviet Union. So Khrushchev replaces Stalin for a long time, and one of the other things that happens during his time is Sputnik, the launch of Sputnik, which is the gets everybody scared out of their minds again, because, oh my gosh, now the Soviets are controlling space, they can drop bombs, they can spy on you. But this was the first Earth or satellite, Earth orbiting, I think that's how you spell orbiting, satellite launched in October of 1957. So now you've got a Soviet satellite flying right overhead. It orbits the Earth several times, this thing that's around the size of a beach ball. And so as everyone freaked out after that, the Soviet Union sends a dog into space to orbit the Earth. It makes me sad, little dog, it's going to die up there. And then the United States sends John Glenn later, and then we strive to get a man on the moon, just because of the Cold War, and this idea of containment is even spreading to outer space. Don't allow the Soviets to get to outer space. So this Cold War tension still continuing, lots of drama between the two sides, as we had started with in class the other day with the U-2 incident. So that's some of the other stuff happening early in the Cold War.